On January 17, 2023, I performed what should have been the most impossible surgery of my career. I say should have been because what I discovered inside that patient's skull defied every principle of neurosurgery I'd learned in 18 years of practice. My name is Dr. Catherine Mills. I was the senior neurosurgeon at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, Tennessee, until I resigned last month. In nearly 2 decades of brain surgery, I thought I'd seen every variation of trauma, tumor, and neurological catastrophe the human brain could endure. I was wrong. The case that ended my career began with a construction accident downtown Nashville. A 35-year-old man named David Holloway was struck in the head by a falling steel beam. The impact should have killed him instantly. Instead, it revealed something about human consciousness that I'm still trying to understand, and frankly, something I wish I'd never discovered. Vanderbilt's Neurosurgery department handles the most complex cases in the Southeast. We perform over 2,000 major brain surgeries annually, treating everything from inoperable tumors to catastrophic trauma. I specialized in cases other surgeons wouldn't touch, the ones where families were told there was no hope. That Tuesday morning in January started like any other. I'd been in surgery since dawn, removing a meningioma from a teacher's brain. The procedure went perfectly, and I was catching up on patient files when everything changed. At 11:47 a.m., my pager buzzed with a message that would alter my understanding of what the human brain is truly capable of. The message was from Dr. James Montgomery, the chief of emergency medicine, and it was marked urgent. Incoming trauma, ETA 8 minutes, severe head injury, need neuroconsult immediately. I had worked with Dr. Montgomery for over a decade, and he wasn't prone to unnecessary urgency. When he called for immediate neurosurgical consultation, it meant we were dealing with a case that would likely require emergency intervention to save a life. I made my way to Trauma Bay 3, where the emergency team was already preparing equipment. The paramedics had called ahead with preliminary information that painted a grim picture. Male patient, approximately 35 years old, found unconscious at a construction site after a scaffolding collapse. The patient had sustained what appeared to be massive blunt force trauma to the skull, with evidence of significant intracranial pressure and possible brain herniation. "What's the mechanism of injury?" I asked Dr. Montgomery as we waited for the ambulance. According to witnesses, a steel beam fell approximately 20 feet and struck him directly on the top of his head. The impact was so severe that it drove his hard hat down past his ears. The construction crew had to use power tools to cut the hat off his head. The ambulance arrived at 11:55 a.m., and the paramedics wheeled in a patient who immediately struck me as being in the worst possible condition for survival. The man appeared to be in his mid-30s, with brown hair matted with blood, and a skull that was visibly deformed from the impact. His head was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and there was obvious depression fracturing across the entire top of his skull. But what caught my attention first wasn't the extent of his injuries, it was his eyes. They were open, alert, and tracking movement around the room with perfect clarity. Patients with this level of head trauma are typically unconscious, unresponsive, or at best showing minimal neurological function. This patient was looking directly at me with intelligent, focused eyes that seemed completely aware of his surroundings. "What's his Glasgow Coma Scale?" I asked the lead paramedic, Tom Wilson, who I had worked with dozens of times over the years. "That's the strange part, Doc. When we arrived on scene, he was unconscious and unresponsive, GCS of 3. But during transport, he just woke up. He's been alert and responsive for the past 15 minutes. Current GCS is 15 inches. A Glasgow Coma Scale of 15 indicates perfect neurological function, normal eye opening, verbal response, and motor response. For a patient with this level of visible brain trauma to have a GCS of 15 was medically impossible. I began my neurological examination while the trauma team worked to stabilize his other injuries. The patient had multiple lacerations on his scalp that were bleeding heavily, but it was the condition of his skull that dominated my attention. I could feel the depression fractures through his scalp, areas where the bone had been crushed inward by at least 2 inches. "Can you tell me your name?" I asked, shining a pen light into his eyes to check his pupillary responses. "David Holloway," he replied clearly, without hesitation. His pupils were equal, round, and reactive to light, another impossibility given the apparent severity of his brain trauma. "Do you know where you are, David?" "I'm in a hospital. Vanderbilt, I think, based on the signage I saw when they brought me in." "Do you remember what happened to you?" "I was working on the Morrison building downtown. I remember hearing someone yell, 'Look out!' and then I remember waking up in the ambulance." His responses were completely appropriate and oriented. He showed no signs of confusion, disorientation, or cognitive impairment. I performed a complete neurological assessment, testing his reflexes, coordination, and motor function. Everything was normal. Better than normal, actually. His reflexes were hyperactive, his coordination was perfect, and his muscle strength was excellent. Dr. Montgomery looked at me with the same confused expression I knew was on my face. "Catherine, I've never seen anything like this. The mechanism of injury should have killed him instantly, or at minimum left him in a persistent vegetative state. How is he talking to us?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Let's get him to CT immediately. I need to see what's happening inside his skull." 20 minutes later, I was staring at CT images that defied every principle of neurosurgery I had learned during my medical training and career. David's skull showed massive depression fractures across the parietal and frontal bones, with bone fragments driven deep into the brain tissue. There was significant brain swelling, multiple areas of hemorrhaging, and what appeared to be extensive damage to critical areas of the brain, including the motor cortex and areas responsible for speech and consciousness. According to these scans, David should have been dead. At minimum, he should have been unconscious, paralyzed, and unable to speak or understand language. The damage I was seeing was incompatible with any level of neurological function, let alone the perfect cognitive performance he was demonstrating. "This can't be right," I told Jennifer Hayes, our head radiologist. "Run the scans again. There has to be some kind of imaging error." Jennifer ran a second CT scan, followed by an MRI for better soft tissue visualization. The results were identical. The imaging clearly showed devastating brain trauma that should have resulted in immediate death or permanent vegetative state. "Catherine, I've been reading brain scans for 20 years, Jennifer said. "I've never seen anything like this. The damage is real. I can see it clearly on multiple imaging modalities. But somehow this patient's brain is functioning normally despite injuries that should have destroyed his ability to think, speak, or even breathe on his own." I returned to David's bedside with the impossible scan results. He was sitting up in bed, talking casually with one of the nurses about the Nashville Predators hockey season. When he saw me approach, he looked directly at me with those same alert, intelligent eyes. "Doc, the nurse says you took some pictures of my brain. How bad is it?" I had delivered devastating neurological news to thousands of patients and families over my career, but I had never faced a situation like this. How do you tell a patient that they have suffered brain injuries that should have killed them when they're sitting in front of you having a normal conversation? "David, I need to be honest with you. The scans show that you've sustained very serious injuries to your brain, the kind of injuries that typically result in significant neurological problems." "But I feel fine," he said. "I mean, I have a headache, and I can feel that my head is swollen, but I can think clearly. I can remember everything. I don't feel like I have brain damage." I consulted with Dr. William Foster, the chief of neurosurgery, about David's case. Dr. Foster had been practicing neurosurgery for over 30 years and had seen some of the most unusual cases in medical literature. Even he was baffled by David's presentation. "The imaging is unambiguous," Dr. Foster said as we reviewed the scans together. "This patient has suffered massive, life-threatening brain trauma. The bone fragments are compressing critical areas of the brain, and the swelling is creating dangerous intracranial pressure. By every medical standard, this patient requires immediate emergency surgery." "But his neurological function is perfect," I pointed out. "He's alert, oriented, speaking normally, with no motor deficits. How do we justify operating on a patient who appears to be neurologically intact?" "We justify it because the imaging shows that without intervention, the swelling and bone fragments will cause progressive brain damage that could result in death within hours. The fact that he's currently functioning normally doesn't change the reality of his injuries." Dr. Foster was right from a medical standpoint, but something about the situation felt fundamentally wrong to me. We were proposing to perform emergency brain surgery on a patient who was talking, thinking, and functioning normally, based solely on scans that showed injuries incompatible with his current condition. After extensive discussion with David and his family, who had arrived at the hospital, we decided to proceed with surgery. The risks of not operating, brain herniation, death from increased intracranial pressure, outweighed the risks of surgical intervention. At 6:30 p.m. that evening, David was wheeled into operating room 7 for emergency craniotomy and evacuation of intracranial hematomas. I had performed this type of surgery hundreds of times over my career, but I had never operated on a patient who was neurologically intact despite having the worst brain trauma I had ever seen. The anesthesia team had difficulty with the initial intubation because David remained alert and conversational even under sedation. Dr. Rachel Turner, our chief anesthesiologist, had to use higher than normal doses of anesthetic agents to achieve the level of unconsciousness needed for surgery. "Catherine, this is unusual," Dr. Turner said as she monitored David's vital signs. "His brain shows massive trauma, but his neurological responses to anesthesia are those of someone with a completely healthy brain." When I made the initial incision and reflected the scalp, the extent of the damage became even more apparent. The skull fractures were severe, with multiple bone fragments driven deep into the brain tissue. As I began to remove the damaged bone and debris, I could see areas of the brain that were completely destroyed, gray matter that had been pulverized by the impact. But as I worked deeper into the surgical field, I began to notice something that challenged my understanding of neuroanatomy. The areas of the brain that appeared completely destroyed on the scans and under direct visualization were areas that should have been critical for basic neurological function. The motor cortex, responsible for voluntary movement, was severely damaged. Parts of Broca's area, essential for speech production, were destroyed. Portions of the frontal lobe, crucial for consciousness and personality, were reduced to pulverized tissue. Yet just hours before, David had been speaking clearly, moving normally, and demonstrating perfect cognitive function. 3 hours into the surgery, as I was removing bone fragments from the deepest part of the injury, I encountered something that I had never seen before in 18 years of neurosurgery. In an area where the brain tissue should have been completely destroyed, I found what appeared to be new neural tissue, brain matter that looked fresh, healthy, and completely undamaged. "Jennifer, can you take a look at this?" I called to our surgical pathologist, Dr. Jennifer Adams, who was in the operating room to examine the tissue specimens we were removing. Dr. Adams looked into the surgical field with the operating microscope. "Catherine, what am I looking at? This tissue looks completely normal. It's not damaged, and it doesn't look like scar tissue. It looks like healthy brain tissue." "That's impossible. This area took a direct impact from the steel beam. The tissue here should be completely destroyed." I took a small biopsy of the healthy-appearing tissue and continued with the surgery. By 10:15 p.m., I had removed all the bone fragments, evacuated the blood clots, and cleaned the surgical site. But the more I worked, the more I found areas of healthy brain tissue in locations where the trauma should have caused complete destruction. The surgery was technically successful. I had addressed all the traumatic injuries and relieved the intracranial pressure. But I was left with questions that I couldn't answer about what I had seen in David's brain. David's recovery was as impossible as his initial presentation. Within 6 hours of surgery, he was awake, alert, and neurologically intact. Most patients who undergo this type of emergency craniotomy require days or weeks to recover basic neurological function, if they recover at all. "Good morning, Dr. Mills," David said when I checked on him the next morning. "How did the surgery go?" "The surgery went well, David, but I need to ask you some questions about how you're feeling." "I feel great. My headache is gone and I don't feel confused or disoriented at all. When can I go home?" I performed a complete neurological examination. David's cognitive function was perfect, his motor skills were normal, and he showed no signs of the deficits that typically result from the type of brain trauma he had sustained. Over the next 3 days, I ran every neurological test available. EEGs showed completely normal brainwave patterns. Cognitive assessments revealed no impairment in memory, reasoning, or executive function. Motor function tests were normal. It was as if David had never sustained a brain injury at all. 5 days after the surgery, Dr. Adams called me with the pathology results on the tissue specimens we had removed from David's brain. "Catherine, I need to discuss these results with you in person. Can you come to my office?" Dr. Adams had been our surgical pathologist for over 15 years, and I had never heard her sound confused or uncertain about pathology results. When I arrived at her office, she had microscope slides and test results spread across her desk. "I've run every test I can think of on these tissue samples," she said. "The damaged brain tissue shows exactly what we would expect from severe blunt force trauma: cellular destruction, hemorrhage, and necrosis. But the healthy tissue samples are unusual." "Unusual how?" "The cellular structure is consistent with normal brain tissue, but there are characteristics that I've never seen before. The neural connections appear to be more complex than typical brain tissue, with increased dendritic branching and synaptic density. It's as if this tissue is more advanced or evolved than normal human brain tissue." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not sure what I'm suggesting. I'm just telling you what I'm seeing under the microscope. This tissue doesn't look like it came from the same brain as the damaged tissue." Dr. Adams showed me the microscope slides. The damaged tissue looked like what I would expect from severe brain trauma, but the healthy tissue showed neural architecture that was more intricate and organized than anything I had seen in normal brain specimens. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" I asked. "Never. I've sent samples to colleagues at other institutions for confirmation, but no one has been able to explain what we're looking at." David was discharged from the hospital 5 days after his surgery with no neurological deficits and no restrictions on his activities. I scheduled him for regular follow-up appointments to monitor his recovery and watch for any delayed complications from his brain injury. At his 2-week follow-up appointment, David appeared to be completely normal. His surgical incision was healing well, and he reported no symptoms or problems. But during our conversation, I began to notice something subtle that hadn't been apparent during his hospitalization. "How has your recovery been at home?" I asked. "It's been interesting, Dr. Mills. I feel completely normal, but there are some things that seem different." "Different how?" "I seem to understand things more quickly than I used to. At work, I can solve complex problems that used to take me hours to figure out. I can remember conversations and details with perfect clarity. It's like my brain is working better than it did before the accident." This was concerning from a neurological standpoint. Patients who suffer severe brain trauma typically experience some degree of cognitive impairment, even if their recovery is good. They don't typically report improved cognitive function. "Can you give me a specific example?" "Last week, I was working on a structural engineering problem that involved complex calculations for load distribution. Before the accident, that kind of problem would have taken me most of the day with multiple references and calculations. But now I can visualize the solution immediately, almost like I can see the stress patterns and load paths in my mind. David was a construction supervisor, not a structural engineer. The type of analysis he was describing required advanced engineering training and years of experience. Over the following weeks, I conducted extensive research into cases similar to David's. I searched medical literature for reports of patients who had recovered from severe brain trauma with improved rather than impaired cognitive function. What I found was a handful of cases scattered across decades of medical literature, but nothing that provided a clear explanation for what I had witnessed. I also began investigating David's background more thoroughly. According to his medical records and employment history, he was a high school graduate who had worked in construction for 15 years. He had no formal training in engineering, mathematics, or any field that would explain his newfound analytical abilities. But as I dug deeper, I discovered some inconsistencies in his background that raised questions about who David Holloway really was. His employment records at the construction company only went back 2 years, despite his claim of having worked in construction for 15 years. His Social Security number had only been active for the past 3 years. Most significantly, there was no record of his existence prior to 2020. I contacted Detective Lisa Morgan at the Nashville Metro Police Department, who I had worked with on previous cases involving patients with suspicious backgrounds. Detective Morgan, I have a patient who was injured in a construction accident, but I'm finding some irregularities in his background that I thought you might want to investigate. What kind of irregularities, Dr. Mills? There's no documentation of his existence prior to 3 years ago. No school records, no previous employment history, no family records. It's as if he appeared in Nashville in 2020 with a completely manufactured identity. Detective Morgan agreed to investigate David's background, but her findings only deepened the mystery. 3 weeks after David's surgery, Detective Morgan called me with information that changed everything about how I understood this case. Dr. Mills, I need to meet with you about your patient, David Holloway. Can you come to the police station this afternoon? When I arrived at Detective Morgan's office, she had a file folder filled with documents and photographs spread across her desk. David Holloway doesn't exist, she said without preamble. The Social Security number belongs to a David Holloway who died in 1987 at the age of 6. The employment records are falsified, and the address he gave doesn't correspond to where he actually lives. Then who is he? We don't know yet, but we've run his fingerprints and DNA through national databases, and we're not getting any matches. It's as if he has no criminal record, no military service, and no official documentation anywhere in the United States. Detective Morgan showed me photographs of David's actual residence, which turned out to be a modest apartment filled with advanced scientific equipment, medical texts, and research materials that suggested knowledge far beyond what a construction worker would possess. Dr. Mills, there's something else. We found evidence in his apartment that suggests he may have been conducting some kind of medical or scientific research. There are detailed anatomical diagrams, neurosurgical texts, and what appear to be experimental notes about brain function and neural regeneration. The implications were staggering. The man I had operated on, who I thought was a construction worker with a miraculous recovery, appeared to be someone with extensive knowledge of neuroscience and brain function. Has he committed any crimes? I asked. Not that we can determine. But Dr. Mills, I think you need to consider the possibility that your patient isn't who he claims to be, and that his recovery wasn't as miraculous as it appeared. I scheduled an emergency appointment with David the following day, ostensibly for a routine post-surgical checkup. When he arrived at my office, I noticed that he carried himself with a confidence and awareness that seemed different from the construction worker I had first met. David, I need to ask you some direct questions about your background and your recovery. Of course, Dr. Mills. What would you like to know? I want to know who you really are. The police investigation has revealed that David Holloway is not your real identity. Your background has been completely fabricated, and your apartment contains scientific materials that suggest knowledge far beyond what you've claimed to possess." David looked at me for a long moment, and I could see something change in his expression. It wasn't surprise or defensiveness. It was the look of someone who had been expecting this conversation. "Dr. Mills, what would you say if I told you that everything you think you know about brain function, neural regeneration, and the limits of human consciousness is fundamentally incorrect?" I'd say that sounds like an interesting theory, but it doesn't answer my question about who you are. My name is Dr. Alexander Vaughn. I have a doctorate in neuroscience from Johns Hopkins University, with specialized research in neural regeneration and consciousness transfer. I work for a research institute that studies advanced neuroscience applications that are not yet acknowledged by mainstream medicine. What kind of research institute? The kind that investigates the possibilities of enhancing human brain function, regenerating damaged neural tissue, and expanding the limits of human consciousness beyond what current medical science believes is possible. Over the next 2 hours, Alexander, if that was really his name, explained a story that challenged everything I thought I knew about neuroscience and the limits of medical possibility. According to his account, he worked for a private research institute funded by technology companies and government agencies that were investigating ways to enhance human cognitive function and repair brain damage through methods that went far beyond current medical capabilities. "We've developed techniques for stimulating neural regeneration that can repair brain damage in real time," he said. "We've learned how to enhance existing neural pathways to increase cognitive function far beyond normal human limits." That's scientifically impossible. Neural tissue in the adult brain doesn't regenerate to the extent you're describing. Not with current medical techniques, no. But we've discovered methods of neural stimulation and cellular regeneration that can restore damaged brain tissue and even enhance function beyond normal human parameters. Alexander described his own case as a test of an experimental neural regeneration protocol. The construction accident had been real, and the brain damage I had seen on the scans was genuine. But during the surgery, he had been subjected to an experimental treatment that stimulated rapid neural regeneration in the damaged areas. The tissue you found during surgery, the healthy neural tissue in areas where there should have been complete destruction, that was regenerated tissue. Brain matter that had been destroyed by the trauma and then regrown using advanced stimulation techniques. "And you volunteered to undergo this experimental treatment?" "I did, but the treatment had effects that we didn't anticipate. The regenerated neural tissue isn't just restored to normal function, it's enhanced beyond normal human cognitive capacity." Alexander went on to explain that the neural regeneration process had resulted in brain tissue that was more advanced than normal human neural architecture. The increased dendritic branching and synaptic density that Dr. Adams had observed in the pathology samples wasn't anomalous. It was the intended result of the experimental treatment. The regenerated tissue allows for processing speeds, memory capacity, and analytical abilities that are far beyond normal human limits. What you observed in my cognitive improvements wasn't a side effect of brain trauma. It was the result of enhanced neural architecture. And the research institute you claim to work for, they're conducting unauthorized human experimentation? Not unauthorized. I volunteered to be a test subject for this experimental treatment. But the institute operates outside normal medical oversight because the techniques we're developing are decades ahead of what mainstream medicine is prepared to accept. Alexander described a research program that was investigating the enhancement of human cognitive abilities through advanced neuroscience techniques. According to him, they had developed methods for repairing brain damage and enhancing function that would revolutionize neurosurgery and neurology if they were accepted by the medical community. "Dr. Mills, what if I told you that the limits you accept for brain function, the idea that severe neural damage is permanent, that cognitive ability is fixed, that consciousness is limited to normal human parameters, what if all of that is wrong?" "I want to show you something," Alexander said. pulling out a tablet computer. These are problems that require advanced mathematical analysis and spatial reasoning that should be impossible for someone without extensive training in engineering and mathematics. He showed me a series of complex structural engineering problems involving load calculations, stress analysis, and three-dimensional modeling. These were problems that would typically require specialized software and hours of calculation by trained engineers. Alexander solved each problem in his head within minutes, providing detailed explanations of his reasoning and arriving at solutions that I later verified were correct. He demonstrated the ability to visualize complex three-dimensional structures, calculate stress distributions across multiple load paths, and optimize designs for maximum efficiency. Before the neural regeneration treatment, I couldn't have solved these problems, he said. My background is in neuroscience research, not structural engineering. But the enhanced neural tissue allows me to process and analyze complex information in ways that normal human cognition can't achieve. You're telling me that this experimental treatment gave you superhuman analytical abilities? I'm telling you that it gave me access to cognitive capabilities that are within the potential range of human brain function, but that are normally limited by the constraints of natural neural architecture. Alexander went on to describe a research program that was investigating not just neural regeneration, but the fundamental enhancement of human cognitive abilities. According to him, the institute had developed treatments that could enhance memory, increase processing speed, and expand analytical capabilities far beyond normal human limits. We're studying ways to unlock the full potential of human consciousness, he said. The human brain has enormous capacity that remains unused because of limitations in neural architecture and synaptic connections. Our treatments can remove those limitations. And how many people have undergone these experimental treatments? Over the past 5 years, approximately 50 volunteers have participated in various phases of the research program. The results have been consistently positive, with significant enhancements in cognitive function and no adverse effects. What about medical oversight and ethics approval for this research? Alexander was quiet for several minutes, and I could see that this was a question that troubled him. Dr. Mills, what would you do if you discovered techniques that could eliminate brain damage, enhance human intelligence, and expand consciousness beyond anything currently possible? But you knew that it would take decades for the medical establishment to accept and approve such treatments. I'd follow proper research protocols and ethics approval processes, regardless of how long they took. Even if that meant allowing millions of people to suffer from brain injuries and cognitive limitations that could be easily treated with techniques that are available right now. The conversation had moved from medical mystery to ethical philosophy. Alexander was describing research that, if legitimate, could revolutionize treatment for brain injuries, cognitive disorders, and the enhancement of human mental capabilities. But he was also describing research that was being conducted outside normal medical oversight and ethics approval. Alexander, even if what you're telling me is true, conducting human experimentation without proper oversight and approval is dangerous and unethical. There's no way to ensure patient safety or evaluate long-term effects. I understand your concerns, and from the perspective of traditional medical ethics, you're correct. But consider this. Every major advancement in medical science has required researchers to push beyond the accepted boundaries of their time. That doesn't justify conducting unauthorized human experimentation. No, it doesn't. But it also doesn't justify allowing treatable conditions to remain untreated because of bureaucratic processes that can take decades to approve new treatments. Alexander described cases where the experimental neural enhancement treatments had successfully restored cognitive function to patients with traumatic brain injuries, degenerative diseases, and developmental disorders. According to him, conditions that were considered permanently disabling could be effectively treated with techniques that were decades ahead of current medical capabilities. Dr. Mills, what if I could show you brain scans from other patients who have undergone these treatments? people with severe traumatic brain injuries who have made complete recoveries, patients with Alzheimer's disease whose cognitive function has been completely restored, individuals with developmental disabilities who now function at genius levels. Alexander showed me tablet computer files containing brain scans, test results, and case reports from dozens of patients who had allegedly undergone various experimental neural enhancement treatments. The documentation appeared authentic and detailed, showing before and after comparisons that suggested dramatic improvements in brain function and cognitive ability. These patients had conditions that are considered incurable by current medical science, he said. Severe brain trauma, degenerative diseases, genetic disorders affecting cognitive function. But after treatment with neural regeneration and enhancement protocols, their brain function has been restored to normal or enhanced beyond normal parameters. The cases he showed me were remarkable, if authentic. Patients with severe Alzheimer's disease, showing complete restoration of memory and cognitive function. Individuals with traumatic brain injuries, demonstrating enhanced analytical abilities. People with developmental disabilities achieving genius-level performance on cognitive assessments. How do I know these cases are real and not fabricated? I asked. You don't, without independent verification. But Dr. Mills, you've seen my case firsthand. You operated on my brain, you saw the extent of the damage, and you've witnessed my recovery and enhanced cognitive function. That's not fabricated. That's something you can verify through your own experience and medical records. He was right. Whatever else Alexander might be lying about, I had personally witnessed his impossible recovery from brain trauma that should have been fatal or permanently disabling. Alexander, what do you want from me? I want your help documenting and understanding what happened during my treatment. I want to approach this systematically and scientifically, and I need a neurosurgeon who can help evaluate whether the treatments we're developing are genuinely effective or if we're deluding ourselves about the results. And what about the ethical issues with unauthorized human experimentation? I want to work toward bringing this research into compliance with standard medical ethics and oversight. But I also want to continue developing treatments that could help millions of people who are currently considered beyond medical help. I spent the next several weeks investigating Alexander's claims and trying to verify the information he had provided. What I found was deeply troubling from both a medical and ethical standpoint. The case reports and brain scans he had shown me appeared to be authentic when I had them reviewed by colleagues at other institutions. The neural enhancement effects he had described were consistent with advanced research in neuroscience and neural regeneration that was being conducted at major universities and research centers. Most significantly, I was able to verify several of the patient cases he had described by contacting the individuals directly. They confirmed their medical histories and the dramatic improvements in cognitive function they had experienced after undergoing experimental treatments. But as I investigated further, I also discovered disturbing aspects of the research program Alexander had described. The experimental treatments were being conducted in secret facilities without oversight from medical institutions or regulatory agencies. Patients were recruited through private networks rather than standard clinical trial procedures, and there was no long-term follow-up to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of the treatments. Most concerning was the discovery that several patients who had undergone experimental neural enhancement treatments had experienced severe psychiatric side effects months or years after their procedures. Enhanced cognitive abilities had been accompanied by personality changes, emotional instability, and in some cases, complete psychological breakdowns. Alexander, I've found cases where patients who underwent your experimental treatments developed serious psychiatric problems after their initial recovery. I'm aware of those cases, Dr. Mills. The neural enhancement treatments can have psychological effects that we're still working to understand and control. And you didn't think this was important information to share with me earlier? I wanted you to evaluate the effectiveness of the treatments based on the medical evidence. not be biased by complications that affect a small percentage of patients. A small percentage? I've found documentation of psychiatric side effects in over 30% of the patients who underwent neural enhancement procedures. Alexander was quiet for several minutes. When he spoke, it was with less confidence than he had shown throughout our previous conversations. Dr. Mills, we're working with techniques that push the boundaries of what human consciousness can handle. Enhanced cognitive abilities come with risks that we're still learning to manage. Alexander, I need to know the truth about who you really are and what kind of research you're actually conducting. He looked at me with those same intelligent eyes that had puzzled me since the day he was brought to the emergency room. But now there was something else in his expression: uncertainty and perhaps fear. The truth is that I don't know the full extent of what we're dealing with, he said. The neural enhancement treatments work, but they change people in ways that we didn't anticipate. Enhanced cognitive function comes with psychological changes that can be profound. What kind of psychological changes? Patients begin to think and perceive reality differently. Their enhanced brains process information in ways that normal human consciousness can't handle. They start to see patterns and connections that others can't perceive. They develop insights into the nature of reality that can be psychologically destabilizing. Are you telling me that the treatment you underwent is affecting your psychological stability? Alexander didn't answer directly, but I could see something change in his expression. The confidence and clarity that had characterized his behavior since the surgery was being replaced by something that looked like confusion or uncertainty. Dr. Mills, what if I told you that I'm not entirely sure what's real anymore? The enhanced cognitive abilities allow me to process information and see patterns that normal human consciousness can't access. But that level of awareness comes with the realization that much of what we consider reality is limited by the constraints of normal human perception. Over the following weeks, I continued to monitor Alexander's psychological state as well as his neurological recovery. What I observed was deeply concerning from a psychiatric standpoint. His enhanced cognitive abilities continued to develop, allowing him to solve increasingly complex problems and demonstrate analytical capabilities that were far beyond normal human limits. But these capabilities came with psychological changes that became more pronounced over time. Alexander began to describe experiences that suggested altered perception of reality. He claimed to be able to predict events before they happened, to understand complex systems through intuition rather than analysis, and to perceive patterns in human behavior and natural phenomena that were invisible to others. Dr. Mills, the enhanced neural tissue doesn't just improve analytical thinking, it changes how consciousness itself functions. I can perceive information and patterns that normal human awareness can't access. Alexander, what you're describing sounds like you're experiencing symptoms that could indicate psychological instability or even psychosis. That's what I thought initially. But what if what I'm experiencing isn't psychological dysfunction, but expanded awareness that normal human consciousness can't comprehend? This was exactly the kind of thinking that concerned me most. Patients with psychiatric disorders often interpret their symptoms as enhanced abilities or special insights, rather than recognizing them as signs of mental illness. As weeks passed, Alexander's condition continued to evolve in ways that were both medically fascinating and psychologically disturbing. His cognitive abilities reached levels that seemed impossible for human brain function, but his grip on conventional reality became increasingly tenuous. He began to speak about perceiving multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously, understanding the fundamental nature of consciousness, and accessing information that existed outside normal space-time parameters. These claims were accompanied by mathematical proofs and scientific explanations that were so advanced, I couldn't evaluate their validity. Dr. Mills, the Research Institute has been monitoring my progress, and they believe the neural enhancement has succeeded beyond their expectations. but they also acknowledge that the psychological effects are more complex than they anticipated. Alexander, I'm concerned that you may be experiencing a psychological break from reality. The symptoms you're describing are consistent with certain types of psychotic disorders. I understand why you would think that. But consider this. If someone's consciousness was genuinely expanded beyond normal human limits, wouldn't their experiences necessarily appear to be symptoms of mental illness to observers with normal awareness? It was a compelling question that got to the heart of how we distinguish between enhanced perception and psychological dysfunction. If someone's consciousness was genuinely operating at a higher level than normal human awareness, their experiences would indeed seem like delusions or hallucinations to people with conventional perception. 3 months after Alexander's surgery, I was contacted by someone claiming to represent the research institute he had described. Dr. Victoria Laurent called my office and requested a meeting to discuss Alexander's case and the experimental treatments he had undergone. Dr. Mills, we understand that you've been working with one of our research subjects, and we'd like to discuss the medical and ethical implications of the treatments he received. Dr. Laurent met me at my office the following day. She appeared to be in her 50s, with the bearing and credentials of a legitimate medical researcher. She claimed to hold a doctorate in neuroscience from MIT and to be the director of research at something called the Advanced Consciousness Institute. Dr. Mills, Alexander volunteered to undergo experimental neural regeneration and enhancement procedures as part of a research program investigating the limits of human cognitive potential. What he experienced during his recovery from brain trauma was the result of cutting-edge techniques that are decades ahead of current medical capabilities. Dr. Laurent, if what you're telling me is true, why is this research being conducted outside normal medical oversight and ethics approval processes? Because the techniques we've developed challenge fundamental assumptions about brain function and human consciousness. The medical establishment isn't prepared to accept research that suggests human cognitive abilities can be enhanced far beyond what's currently considered possible. Dr. Laurent showed me documentation of research programs being conducted at private facilities across the country, investigating neural enhancement, consciousness expansion, and cognitive augmentation through advanced neuroscience techniques. According to Dr. Laurent, Alexander's case was part of a larger research program that had been investigating human consciousness enhancement for over a decade. The research was funded by technology companies and government agencies that were interested in developing ways to enhance human cognitive abilities for scientific, military, and commercial applications. We've developed techniques that can not only repair brain damage, but enhance cognitive function far beyond normal human limits, she said. The neural regeneration you witnessed in Alexander's case is just one application of these methods. And how many people have been subjected to these experimental procedures? Over the past 10 years, several hundred volunteers have participated in various phases of our research. The results have been consistently positive in terms of cognitive enhancement, but we've also encountered psychological effects that we're still working to understand. Dr. Laurent acknowledged that the neural enhancement treatments could result in psychological changes that were difficult for patients to manage. Enhanced consciousness came with perceptual abilities that could be overwhelming or destabilizing for individuals who weren't prepared for such dramatic changes in awareness. Alexander is experiencing expanded consciousness that allows him to perceive aspects of reality that are normally beyond human awareness. From his perspective, he has gained incredible insights into the nature of consciousness and reality. From the perspective of normal human psychology, his experiences appear to be symptoms of mental illness. Dr. Laurent, what you're describing is unauthorized human experimentation that violates every principle of medical ethics and research safety. These procedures are being conducted without proper oversight, informed consent, or long-term safety monitoring. Dr. Mills, we understand your concerns about research ethics, but consider the implications of what we've discovered. We have techniques that can eliminate brain damage, cure cognitive disorders, and enhance human intelligence beyond anything previously possible. Should we abandon this research because of bureaucratic concerns about approval processes? Yes, if it means protecting patients from experimental procedures that haven't been properly tested for safety and effectiveness. But what about the patients who could be helped right now with treatments that exist but aren't approved? What about people with traumatic brain injuries, degenerative diseases, and cognitive disorders who could be cured with techniques that are available today? It was the same ethical argument Alexander had made, that the potential benefits of the research justified conducting it outside normal medical oversight. But I had seen the psychological effects of the treatments firsthand, and I knew that the risks were substantial. Dr. Laurent, Alexander is experiencing psychological symptoms that suggest the neural enhancement treatments may be causing serious mental health problems. How can you justify continuing this research when you know it can result in psychiatric complications? The psychological effects are a necessary consequence of expanded consciousness. When human awareness is enhanced beyond normal limits, individuals necessarily experience reality in ways that can be difficult to integrate with conventional psychological frameworks. After months of investigating Alexander's case and the research program he had described, I reached a conclusion that fundamentally changed how I approached neurosurgery and medical practice. The neural enhancement treatments were real, and they were effective at enhancing cognitive function beyond normal human limits. But they came with psychological costs that made them dangerous and potentially harmful to patients who underwent them. Alexander's enhanced cognitive abilities continued to develop, but his psychological stability continued to deteriorate. He began experiencing episodes of confusion, disorientation, and what appeared to be complete detachment from reality. The enhanced consciousness that had initially seemed beneficial was becoming a form of psychological imprisonment. Most disturbing was the realization that Alexander couldn't return to normal consciousness even if he wanted to. The neural enhancement was permanent, and the psychological effects were progressive and irreversible. I tried to continue monitoring Alexander's condition and working with the Research Institute to understand the long-term effects of neural enhancement treatments. But I found myself increasingly unable to function as a neurosurgeon when I knew that techniques existed that could revolutionize brain surgery, but that came with unacceptable risks to patient psychological well-being. 6 months after Alexander's surgery, I submitted my resignation from Vanderbilt University Medical Center. In my resignation letter, I cited personal reasons for leaving, but the truth was that his case had fundamentally undermined my confidence in the ethical boundaries of medical research and treatment. I moved to a small practice in rural Tennessee where I work as a general physician, treating routine medical problems and avoiding cases that require advanced neurological intervention. I deliberately chose a practice that wouldn't expose me to the ethical dilemmas and impossible medical situations that had characterized my experience with Alexander. But I still think about his case every day. I wonder what happened to him after I stopped monitoring his condition. I wonder how many other patients are undergoing experimental neural enhancement treatments at private research facilities. And I wonder if the medical community will ever be ready to acknowledge that techniques exist for enhancing human consciousness, even if they come with psychological risks that we're not prepared to manage. Most of all, I wonder if Alexander was right when he suggested that expanded consciousness necessarily appears to be mental illness to observers with normal awareness. Because if he was right, then everything we think we know about the limits of human cognitive potential and the nature of psychological health might be based on the constraints of our own limited perception. The case of Alexander Vaughan will always remain for me the most unexplained and disturbing experience of my career as a neurosurgeon. It taught me that the boundaries between medical miracle and psychological catastrophe might be thinner than we realize, and that the human brain contains potential that we are only beginning to understand, and that we may not be ready to safely unleash. I sleep better now in my rural practice, but I still wonder about the dozens of patients who are allegedly undergoing neural enhancement procedures at research facilities across the country. Because somewhere out there might be people walking around with enhanced consciousness that allows them to perceive reality in ways that normal human awareness can't comprehend. And I'm not sure any of us are prepared for what that really means about the nature of human consciousness and the limits of medical intervention. The brain I operated on that day in January 2023 still haunts me, not because of what I found, but because of what it revealed about possibilities that we may not be wise enough to pursue.